Welcome everyone to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connects monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Scogan, the AURI Director of Government Relations and your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing, purposeful connection to resources and partners along the value chain and increased knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Now today we'll be hearing from Elena Byrne, a local food specialist at Renewing the Countryside. In that role, Elena works to facilitate growth for regional farm and food businesses through research, networking, and communications, including work with Feast, Local Foods Network, and the Artisan Grain Collaborative. Remember, you are and will remain muted, but we will be answering your questions at the end of the presentation. So send us your questions through the Q&A portal. And with that, Elena Byrne, welcome to AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad to be here today. I will be presenting today on a project called Local Sourcing for Food Manufacturing in Minnesota that was conducted by Renewing the Countryside in partnership with AURI, funded by AURI and MDA. And I'm grateful for the chance to talk about this exciting work. So just as an overview, I will give a little bit of background and then describe the project. We'll cover some data and themes and recommendations and we'll wrap it up. On Renewing the Countryside, and first on me, my background is in nutritional sciences, and that's where I come into local foods. I think that engagement is really important. Renewing the Countryside works with a great spirit of collaboration and innovation, focused on enriching rural areas that in ways that provide for a just and sustainable and vibrant environment, which includes enriching connections between rural and urban places. The programming includes farm to school and farm to early care programming and speed dating, farmland access work, a farmers market aggregation project, which is like a virtual food hub, as well as blazing trails training through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's program to provide information on regulations for starting food businesses. Along the work that Renewing the Countryside does to increase markets for regional farms was co-founding the Feast Local Foods Network and annual marketplace festival and trade show. And that event at its core is about finding markets for regional farmers. Because the event involves applications for vendors to attend where they are asked about their sourcing as one of the factors for approval, as well as some inquiry about scale. So over the past 6 years of holding the Feast Local Foods Network, there have been 278 different small to mid-sized food businesses that have attended. Among those attendees, as you would imagine, given that it is held in Minnesota, in Rochester actually, 68% of those all-time exhibitors have been from Minnesota, with 23 from Wisconsin. We also draw from Iowa, but that has been a little bit more difficult to attract vendors. They are frequently pulled in multiple directions for events such as this. So the project overview is that we originally reached out, or we're looking at small to mid-sized food manufacturers because they represent a market channel for Minnesota's agricultural producers. And food manufacturers might be interested in sourcing ingredients from local regional producers for a variety of reasons. At the same time, they have requirements for the ingredients that they source and have a great need for efficiency to be financially sustainable. So we set out to gather best practices among those who are using local and regional suppliers, as well as to amass information about challenges and barriers among those who do not source ingredients locally or who don't source as many as they would like to source locally. So our subject pool was primarily Minnesota-based small to mid-sized food businesses who are intentionally sourcing Minnesota ingredients or interested in doing so. We differentiate intentionally because there have been some history of businesses that have always sourced locally, such as dairies, or sources that are commingled in terms of their sourcing, like grain. So our first point of data collection was focus groups, which included 4 separate occasions. One was a traditional in-person focus group, one was a virtual video call focus group, and 2 were panel discussions. And we coordinated these by sector. Some of them included a couple of farmers, but they were primarily food businesses. And among those 4 food groups, there were focus groups, there were 19 participants. The second phase was a 20-question survey, which specifically defined local sourcing as Minnesota grown. We also were looking at businesses that were not vertically integrated. Therefore, they were looking to purchase ingredients. After filtering out those that were vertically integrated and also incomplete responses, we had 63 responses. The final stage was interviews by phone with 9 different food manufacturers, in addition to 1 entrepreneur that is developing a platform or was developing a platform for online sales. So themes that came up during the focus groups are listed here. The quality and product attributes theme was brought up in every one of those discussions. The relationships and communication theme was also frequently brought up, and that included finding sources. So starting out those relationships and developing those. Risk and contracts were frequently brought up in discussions of vegetable crops as a contingency, but also as a way that could be beneficial for farms as well, in that it would be a way to get intentions and demand down in black and white. Quantities came up on both sides, both ends of the equation. Kind of, if you're small, you might not be able to reach minimums, and if you're large, you might not be able to get enough from local suppliers. Infrastructure included intermediate processing as well as storage. Cost was brought up in every single discussion as well. And consumer education and buyer expectations were brought up in the sense that the value of local needed to be conveyed. In the survey, as I said, we primarily targeted Minnesota businesses. And you can see in the map that most were in Minnesota. These were the business locations. Because we also reached out to feast exhibitors, we did have some from Iowa and Wisconsin responding. You can see the age ranges of the business owner respondents, which was as expected, I think, except that over 60 number was a little bit surprising. In addition to that, 89% of the respondents said that they had 1 to 2 business owners, and 79% included a woman business owner. How long have you been in business was not too surprising. You can see a couple outliers. One of those was a meat business and one was a vegetable processing business. The large chunk of those, 56%, had been in business 3 to 8 years. 76% were 3 to 12 years. So some experience there. In terms of revenue, you can really see how important this business aspect is for agriculture, and how much this represents a market. 52% were at the $100,000 or less, but there's also a significant number that were above that. For market channels utilized, you can see that 81% of those used e-commerce at the time of the survey, which was in 2019, so it was definitely pre-COVID. You can see that farmers markets and direct to store were also important. And this was a check all that applies, so there were numerous responses from many of the people, and actually 60% were using from 2 to 4 different channels to sell product. Distribution region, probably not surprising that the Twin Cities was dramatically prevalent, as well as throughout Minnesota. So getting into the data, this first graph shows the different categories purchased overall, not just the local sourced ingredients. I did not include the information on the other category, but it was a wide range of processing aids and other types of ingredients. So then getting into the ingredients, Minnesota grown, there were 40 responses that produce at least some Minnesota grown ingredients. And we didn't ask, but this would probably have been much larger positive response if we had just asked about regional purchases, so border states, or given a mile definition. So acknowledging that Minnesota grown is a little bit narrow and sometimes difficult for businesses that are close to the borders of the of the border states. So looking at those ingredients that are purchased that are from Minnesota, we gathered this as open-ended. So then we worked to kind of collapse and combine to get a sense of what those different ingredients were. And you can see some prevalent things like honey and maple syrup, even buckwheat and apples, very popular. So we asked for an estimate of the percent of local ingredients by weight and gave them equations, and we had 29 that were able to give an estimate. So the average was 49% of ingredients by weight from Minnesota with a mode of 10. We also asked what were the resources that were useful in locating Minnesota grown ingredients. And consistent with what we heard in the other data collection was farmers markets were very important, which is a way to not only find the source, but also begin a relationship. Other regional food businesses, in other words, peers, was also significant. The other category of at the bottom, when we looked into that, was also a lot of things like word of mouth and networking. So it may not have been other food businesses, it might have been distributors or other people in the industry. looking at the networking platforms that were mentioned here in the comments, included things like Minnesota IFT and Feast. Looking at the barriers to using local farm products. This was an open-ended question where we kind of went through and found the themes. Price was mentioned the most often. Specifically noted that the manufacturers mentioned that they thought growers wanted retail pricing and were not able to do that. But frequently mentioned that they were willing to buy in larger quantities than what could be sold retail, meaning farmers markets and other things that are direct to consumer. For availability, they frequently noted that the products that they needed weren't grown here or that they weren't in an efficient form. So for example, herbs might be available in Minnesota, but to be able to buy them dried already in quantity from a distributor was more efficient for them. Consistency, reliability of source, and quality also is something where distributors were mentioned as just being very responsive and always able to produce what was needed or provide what was needed. The mention of distribution included getting product to the facility as well as the timing factor, having it there when they needed it and having it quickly. We also asked in the survey suggestions of how they thought food businesses could approach the issue and could think of increasing their local sourcing. So they suggested that facilitation would be helpful. And in that, they requested things like online databases for ordering to make it efficient, as well as having the option to pull from different sources, basically having the platform serve as aggregation. And we have actually seen that happen during COVID, so that has been interesting to see. Also, reverse marketing is just a term that I put in there to mean that there were some discussions of being able to have buyers state what they would like to purchase so that growers could see that and be responsive. Cost interventions included some comments that maybe growers are already selling at a low price to grocery stores, but maybe aren't giving that same low price to food manufacturers, as well as ways that end users could understand more what local sourcing did for the community and the ecosystem, and therefore understand why products that source locally might end up having a higher price tag. Infrastructure to support and intermediate processing was mentioned, partially due to the seasonal nature in the upper Midwest, things like IQF to be able to take advantage of produce when it's ripe and ready, as well as the storage that would be needed for that. Things like cleaning and milling infrastructure for grain and not needing to just go to the large mills. As well as services and education for both growers and food businesses. Basically more discussion about systems for wholesale from both sides, as well as to facilitate connections. And then moving into the interview, some of the same themes were brought up, but we just had a chance to dig in a little bit deeper. So the interview data was kind of compiled with a fine-tooth comb and pushed into categories, as well as some of the interviewees were requested to be pulled into case studies. So those case studies will be available as part of the report when that is released later this month, I believe. So just to give an overview of some of the things that were discussed during the interviews, like I said earlier, on quantities, there are both sides of the spectrum where small businesses might feel like they can't hit the order minimums to order local product, especially I would think from distributors, which would have the order minimums. Large businesses also then feel like local sources wouldn't have enough and they would need to aggregate. For quality and specs, there are certain things like if a product contains fruit, but they have it formulated for frozen fruit, it means a different formulation if you're using fresh, as well as the labor aspect of processing something that's raw, more labor and more waste. Availability, so as manufacturers need certain specs for their formulations, they may not find, for example, the right variety of garlic that has the flavor that they want, as well as not having just products that can grow in Minnesota. Then the topic of co-packers was also mentioned as a challenge. Co-packers or co-manufacturers, however it's termed, represents an efficiency for food businesses, but also can mean losing control over the sourcing. The co-packer may already have sources that are efficient for them, that they have relationships with, and they would rather use those sources. And especially if you're a small business that's just moving into co-packing, you don't have the leverage to be able to determine the sourcing. In addition, co-packers are large operations and they have food safety standards that will mean documentation is needed for those ingredients. So sometimes that can be a little bit of a disconnect with using smaller producers. Distributors and aggregators was also brought up as before in the survey, because they can be responsive and quick, they are attractive for sourcing. But on the downside, they buy from a wide range of sources, so you don't necessarily have control or know where those sources are. Smaller businesses might hesitate to make inquiries from those aggregators as to the ingredients origins, but I think that varies a lot from business to business. A couple that I spoke with said that they do ask and they just don't have a lot of control, and they have to be willing to understand that it's aggregated and it could come from one of maybe 4 sites. And then also, as mentioned, the cost of bringing in raw ingredients includes time and labor. And then there's the dimension of the relationship aspect where they know that these growers put a lot of effort into it and they need a certain price to be sustainable. And so sometimes food businesses don't want to ask or demand a lower price because they understand the plight of the farmers. And some have explained, you know, I might not be able to pay as much, but I will buy your whole crop, something like that. So there is a dialogue that can happen. And then another dimension that also was brought up in the other data was that to buy local sources of product, of ingredients, will increase your cost of goods and needs to increase your selling price. Consumers might not understand that. Some will, who are local advocates, but I think some of the food businesses were saying they need more help communicating that to the public. There needs to be more easily communicated points on the multiplier effect for a community that has these farmers and food businesses coordinated selling product. So being able to factor that into the cost of goods, basically, and knowing that it won't hurt their bottom line. So we asked them about their priorities when selecting a supplier, and as expected from the other information, ingredient specs and quality frequently were number one. It was the most often given response, as well as being able to get what they need at the price they need it. Responsiveness, willingness to work with a small producer and ship quickly, all kind of speak to that efficiency need, as well as being able to get the documentation, certificate of analysis or information on allergens, certifications for any claims that you want on your final product, etc. So relationship and being family owned wasn't the top of this list, but I think it's because that's not a factor when selecting a supplier. I think that's something that develops over time. So just as in the survey, we also asked during the interview, what were the means of locating local ingredients? And this was a pretty broad list, but included some interesting things. So again, we see distributors, farmers markets, industry shows for networking. And for these larger shows, including Expo West and East were mentioned. And in that sense, the message I got on that was that businesses exhibiting at those larger shows will sometimes be approached by ingredients suppliers. Also the National Organic Program Integrity Database, if you are looking for ingredients that are organic, that is something that is efficient because there's already this certification process in place. So all that information is available online very neatly, which I'll show in a coming slide. The Minnesota Grown Directory in print and online was mentioned, as well as an online service run by FSIS, the Meat and Poultry Inspection Division, which I will also show. Online marketplace options were mentioned, as well as referrals. So there are ways out there. It's just that it takes some skill and some finesse, I think, to kind of work through all of these and find the ingredients. And I think sometimes it might not be the low-hanging fruit. When you need something, you might go with the first thing that you find. So I think having a range of options and finding them, getting this information out there, I think is helpful. So the Organic Integrity Database, if you're not familiar with, is very searchable, and because there's the system for getting all of these businesses certified and lots of paperwork, this information is all available and searchable. So in this quick screenshot, you can see that you can select for the state. You can select for that you want crops, and there's also the handling category. But if you want just raw ingredients, you would just select for crops. And then as you can see in this, at the bottom of the screen here, for this particular search, there were 1,011 records for Minnesota. And then this FSIS database that was mentioned during the meat focus group is also useful and very searchable. And again, it's something that's possible because there is this infrastructure, this certification and inspection documentation process, that the information's available. So the best practices that we have pulled together from these interviews to pass along to food businesses that want to increase their local sourcing are listed here. So seek opportunities to make group purchases to reach minimum order sizes. I think that's something that sounds great. I think in practice, it's probably very difficult to do. But I think places such as shared use kitchens are the places that are actually doing this type of thing from time to time. Build relationships with local distributors as your production grows. So you may not be able to hit minimums initially, but building that up, being aware of what those minimums are so that when you're ready to jump to that, you can do it for efficiency. Source directly from an intermediate processor when your scale allows. So if you can go to that processor instead of having the distributor in between, that would be a way for a bit of a price break. Might not be as efficient in terms of distribution, but it's a shortening of the supply chain. Another suggestion was to develop a protocol for assessing suppliers in pursuit of continuous improvement. So having standards and selecting for factors like who can give me a quantity discount is an efficiency standard, as well as some objectives you might have that are part of your brand identity, such as agricultural or environmental practices, social or employee practices, etc. And especially this is important for ingredients that you might not be able to get locally, but for brand identity to be able to tell a great, powerful story of a mission statement as a business to be able to have those ideals in place. The suggestion was if you're sourcing through an aggregator, ask about product origins. They have that information available, it's just not always transparently readily available to food businesses buying those ingredients. If sourcing from a grower, consider written agreements, which will help you manage your risk, help you ensure that you're getting quality and quantity and the specs that you need, and could potentially help the grower with their planning and just help everyone to know in black and white what's expected. And then also for this intermediate processing step, there was a recommendation to consider contracting that intermediate processing so that you can purchase the raw ingredients and have a little bit of control over that step of it. Then some kind of higher level recommendations for things that the agencies and nonprofits that are working in this environment can do to help support this change among manufacturers to increase their local sourcing are shown here. So increased technical support for marketing efforts that highlight the value of local sourcing, as was mentioned before. So if they're sourcing locally and they have that in their website description to make sure that that's something that they have tools to help communicate and that the public is hearing this from multiple sources, that there is this larger benefit to supporting businesses that are pulling from regional growers and helping tell that story. So the more manufacturers can tell the story of their growers and have that transparency will help them as long as the customers understand that and appreciate that and take that into effect and take that into account when they're purchasing. Also the suggestion to provide support and education for both sides of the equation, meaning farmers and manufacturers, on the use of platforms that facilitate sales between farmers and manufacturers. So this is something that's changed just in the past few months with COVID. A lot more businesses have been forced into getting product online, forced into learning the platforms that are out there. And we have seen just in the past 5 years, a lot of change in what's available in terms of platforms. And many of those specifically were mentioned during our data collection, and they're changing already. some platforms have already disappeared and others have absorbed them. And so I think that's a great thing. The other thing is the fact that there are so many of them is a little bit of a deterrent. So if that collapses into fewer, that might help make sure that the platforms that are available are more comprehensive and more growers are available on a single platform, because again, that efficiency component for a manufacturer to be able to go onto one platform and see as many of the growers available as possible is important. Another suggestion was to think about creative solutions for distribution. And I think a lot of times if you're buying from local farms as a manufacturer, you might have to figure out the distribution or the delivery yourself. So one suggestion was distribution cooperatives. Those could optimize efficiency. And I think with technology, that would be something that would be an innovative pursuit, could potentially reduce costs as well. And then finally, just to continue networking opportunities, because word of mouth and peer support is a great way that entrepreneurs like to learn and discover things and exchange information. So that pretty much wraps it up. I would like to thank the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and AURI for funding the investigation into this important topic. And the staff at Renewing the Countryside that was all part of this effort, Eli Goodwell and Jan Jonides, sorry Jan, who is also on this call today. Jane Jewett of the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture was also a consultant on the project and is preparing some fact sheets to go along with the report. And then guidance and support from the team at AURI, Ashley, Lolly, Jason, Michael, and Jen. And then last but not least, all of the food businesses that participated in this effort that kind of worked through the scheduling difficulties to be a part of the focus groups and to be available for the interviews. Some of those conversations were long because they were so fascinating. So thank you to all of them as well. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for being interested in this topic and listening. My email is here on the slide, and more background can be found at the website for Renewing the Countryside and for the Feast Local Foods Network. And Jan, as I said, is on the call today. So if there are questions, they can be directed to me or more broadly to Jan. And with that, I'll hand it back to Dan.
Thanks, Elena, and very good. We are going to our Q&A or question and answer piece of the webinar now. At the bottom of your screen, if you've been looking for it, we are using the Q&A portal. So just click on that and send us your question if you would like. Jan, I think before we take the first question, if I could just have you do a quick introduction of yourself so the people who are listening today understand who has joined us.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Great. I'm Jan Jonides, and I am the executive director and one of the co-founders of Renewing the Countryside. And we've been working in this food space since we started nearly 20 years ago. And yeah, really enjoyed working on this project and have done some work with some national partners too on sourcing from small to mid-sized farms. And I am located in Zumbro Falls, Minnesota, just for some geographic.
Excellent. We're glad you're with us today. And we do have some questions coming in. First one is going to be talking about price and the value of the crops raised. Could you discuss the difference between perceived price increase for buying local and actual price increase between local, regional, and non-local regional foods? To conflate higher price with local is dangerous and doesn't account for the economies of scale with mid-sized diversified farms. It's more accurately framed as the real cost of production and needs to be cross-referenced with infrastructural investments. So I know there was some reference to the costs of local foods, and I think this particular listener would like to have some explanation of that.
Sure. Yeah, really good point, and thank you for bringing that up. I think, like I said, food businesses kind of obviously need to watch their bottom lines, and I heard from a lot of the smaller ones especially, who don't have the leverage to kind of negotiate bulk purchases from local suppliers, but also have respect for the cost of goods, especially for those who are using ingredients that are processed already. So, for example, one was using pickles as an ingredient. And I think, as we know, pickles are available as a commodity, as a mainline product that are not expensive, whereas kind of artisan small business made pickles would be more expensive. So their very honest feeling was just that there was no way that they could pay what those locally made pickles were worth. And I appreciate what you're saying, that it's dangerous to conflate local and economies of scale. But I think just in terms of the local sourcing aspect, it is sometimes complex and intermingled, that it is sometimes both in an inefficiency of scale as well as the increased cost because it is a smaller farm that has more manual labor and more employees. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so as well. When aggregation is a preferred way for food businesses to source, yet farmers historically do not participate in aggregation platforms, there seems to be a disconnect in the supply chain. Will there be a way to communicate these findings directly for say, the vegetable farmers?
I do think that there are, like I was saying, there are more and more platforms that are available for online sales. The Farmers Market Aggregation Food Hub that I mentioned at the outset is something that is a regional project. And this is something Jan might want to jump in on, but is an attempt to actually do just that, to allow institutional buyers to find various growers of a given product and purchase quantities from the different growers to fill their scale needs.
Jan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think I can jump in. So we've been have this working with farmers markets as food hubs that are non-bricks and mortar, and getting farmers to use the platform to aggregate product. I have to say is much easier now with COVID. Prior to that, getting them to put things up onto the platform was a lot more encouragement and trying to talk them into it. But with COVID, there was a lot more acceptance of that. And I think a lot of it too is just education of how this can work. So we're starting to see more of a willingness and kind of some ahas amongst the produce farmers in particular that we're working with, looking to supply schools in particular right now is something we've been working on. So I think it is, I think just in general, in all the work we've seen over the years, it takes some of those early adopters to have some success, and then people are more willing to kind of jump on the train. So hopefully that will be one of the positive things that comes out of all the negatives that have come out of the pandemic.
Through this survey, did you get a sense of the size of business at which point it could efficiently source locally, meet minimum volumes, or gain attractive and competitive pricing? Is there a size of business that's optimal?
That's a great question. We didn't specifically ask that. I think the survey would probably be the best way of assessing that. And I didn't look specifically at that, but we could glean that from filtering by size and looking at the ingredient sourcing by weight and look at the volume. Because a lot of times with the feast work that we've done through the jury process of looking at ingredient sourcing for approval to allow exhibitors to attend the event, we see things where maybe they're just getting one thing locally. So for example, honey or butter. And that's great. We're always happy to see one thing, but I think what we'd love to see more of is to have the main ingredient be sourced locally. So for example, one processor I talked to sources garbanzo beans and just said that there weren't enough in Minnesota. But really, I think that's an education point and also could be helped a lot by this kind of reverse marketing idea where the buyers have a platform to say what they're looking for, and that can help guide growers.
Is there, go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on that, just kind of anecdotally, having talked to a number of businesses. I think there's just so many different factors involved where I've seen really small businesses very successfully be able to work with farmers, but I've also seen much bigger ones if the infrastructure and the supply chain and if they need things dried, if all those things are in place. So it is a really interesting question, and just kind of what I've seen, it just seems there are a lot of different factors you would need to consider to see if there's actually kind of like a best size for this to work or scale.
Is there,
Yes.
or will there be a report on all of this?
Yes, thanks. And I just want to jump. So the answer is yes, and that will be available from the AURI website, hopefully not too long from now. And I just want to add to what Jan said in that it is complex, and I think a lot of the determination of when a business really makes that extra effort to source locally is just their own brand identity and what their business objectives are and their mission. And so one of the businesses that did agree to be involved in a case study was 7 Sundays. And I'll just call them out because the report does mention them specifically. And so to Jan's point, they are growing. They're on the larger end of things in terms of the scope of this study. And they're at the point where they're now contracting and driving things like research to build up a kind of new environment of more growers for things like oats and buckwheat. So I think it really gets down to how much that's a part of the business identity and goals and mission.
Just a couple more questions. Did the survey, will the report, or has Renewing the Countryside tried to actually identify or describe what local is in this realm, and have they tried to put a value on that?
Well, the second half of that is difficult. For the first half, I would say that yes, for this study, partially because Minnesota Department of Ag and AURI were the funders, we tried to primarily focus on Minnesota grown as the definition of local, which as everyone probably knows, there are many different definitions of local, whether it's a radius of 100 miles or 400 miles or within your state, or I think on the extreme end of definitions of local, it's buying from a farmer that you actually know personally. So I think the value of local is something that we need to continue to work to try to explain that it has an economic benefit for the community, and that it means jobs created, and it means more value to the community to have these place-based businesses with high ideals and passions that are giving back to the community.
I was intrigued by the reverse marketing, and I get where those people would love to have items coming in that they need, but at the same time, how do we drive variety for those who produce the product?
I'm not sure I understand the question of how we drive variety, but I do think that on a small scale, that relationships piece of it does allow for buyers, aka food businesses, to have those conversations about, could you grow this variety for me, or could you grow more of this? And so I think the idea for a platform where that can be broadcast is just a way for growers to potentially tap into a market that they might not be aware of and build a relationship they don't already have.
Perfect. Elena or Jan, final comments from you. Oh, we have one more question that just came in. With a contract, I will grow almost anything. Well, okay, there you go.
Excellent. And yeah, and I would just add university researchers into that as well, because as we know, Minnesota is a particular region, and with climate change that can be tricky. And so thinking about varieties and which varieties will grow in the region, I think is important.
Thank you very much. Jan?
I would just say that I think this local sourcing and whatever definition of local one is going to use is just going to become of more interest. I think we've seen a growth in it just in the few years that we've been doing Feast. People understand it more. Companies are looking more at that as something that they're interested in. So we appreciate the interest and the opportunity to work on this and look forward to seeing what's going to happen in the future.
Excellent. I want to thank Jan Joanitis, the Executive Director at Renewing the Countryside, and the food specialist, Elena Byrne. And that concludes our AURI Connects webinar Wednesday for today, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. Now in September, we will have an in-depth discussion on the food waste value chain with special guest Dr. Claire Sand. As part of the 2019 Ag Innovation Partnership Program, AURI partnered with the food loss expert Dr. Claire Sand on packaging technology and research to identify opportunities to sustainably reduce food loss and waste in Minnesota food processing, while exploring new uses for the remaining food waste. So join us September 9th from noon till 1. And you can register right now at auri.org/webinar-Wednesday.